I can be a bit creative, right? I don't have to just do the show.
I'm Joan Bailey, Vice President for Mission and Identity. The College of New Rochelle today celebrates Founders Day. The day especially set aside to retell the stories of St. Angela Merici, the foundress of the Ursulines, Mother Irene Gill, foundress of the College of New Rochelle, and Sister Dorothy Ann Kelly, who led the college through its dramatic transformation from one school educating young women by adding the 3 additional schools that now educate women and men of all ages and make up the College of New Rochelle today. We use their stories to inspire, but also to remind ourselves of the special calling we have, because we've assumed responsibility for carrying forward in new ways this Ursuline project. This Catholic women's college, committed to the education and full development of women and men of conscience for service to society. This is the College of New Rochelle. Appropriately, we also use this day to reason together, to engage one another in the examination of a topic at the intersection of faith and culture. This evening, to lead us in that engagement, is Dr. Christine Hinze. She received her BA and MA from the Catholic University of America and her PhD in Christian social ethics from the University of Chicago. In 2006, following 16 years on the theological faculty at Marquette University, she became professor of Christian ethics at Fordham University and associate director of the Center for Ethics Education at Fordham, with a focus on foundational questions in Christian social ethics, Christian feminist ethics, and Catholic social thought in relation to economy, family and work, and social transformation. Dr. Hinze pays particular attention to dynamics and disparities surrounding gender, race, and class. She is the author of Comprehending Power in Christian Social Ethics and Radical Sufficiency, the Legacy and Future of the Catholic Living Wage Agenda. Dr. Hinze serves on the board of Collegium, a colloquy on faith and intellectual life supported by over 63 Catholic colleges and universities.
Help take care of the home economy, not the other way around. Okay, things are a little mixed up though, in the real world. Okay. To this end, the Catholic teaching has advocated what is called a family living wage that can support, in combination with state policies, if needed, not only the wage earner or benefits, for example, not only the wage earner, but the full-time presence of an adult caring for the household. So through one full-time salary, or maybe a little bit more, if we were in a just world, if this was a just situation, the household could be modestly kept going, and, God willing that there were 2 people, 2 adults in the home if there were children, one full-time adult could be home to take care of the home duties. Wouldn't that be a world? It's kind of like the Leave It to Beaver world, that we saw on TV, Ozzie and Harriet, like the old TV sitcoms, where, I imagine, the mom with the sort of the apron on, and cooking and all that stuff, and dad goes home, comes back, and so forth. But underneath that, if you take off that sort of, funny cover, this idea that a household needs work as well as society, through one full-time adult job, or you could split it up 2/30s, 2/25s, that would be a just situation where you could take care of the home and also contribute to the society. Until the later 20th century, the Catholic Living Wage Agenda did assume the gendered ideal of the full-time male breadwinner and supporting the full-time female homemaker and children. The Catholic tradition has taken on the sort of assumptions of, where men and women are just like any other tradition. So up till the later 20th century, the idea was that man goes out to work and the woman should stay at home. Although that's changed. Living wages for single women and female heads of household, even 100 years ago, were also called for because there were lots of women working 100 years ago. This idea of this, mom staying home home dad out working, remained the goal that Catholic teaching upheld. As changes occurred in the later 20th century and more women went into the waged workforce throughout the world, all over the world this is happening, and with far less supports than we have in the United States, as bad as it is for us. And you can say by choice in some cases, but mostly by necessity. Catholic speech concerning economic livelihood has expanded, and now you'll hear the popes talk about women's full and equitable participation in both the household and the waged economies. But official teaching also has continued to say that economic participation should not require that women give up their duties and their unique role in the care economy of the household, especially as mothers of young children. There's this sense somehow that that's an important role that only a mom can do, and the workplace should be set up in a way so that moms can do that. Not that they don't work, but there should be a priority given to that. Now that's controversial, not everybody agrees with that, but that's what they say. Now in fact, as they entered the paid workforce in many numbers over the past 50 years, women have found it difficult to conform to what's expected in the paid workforce. The modern paid workforce asks people to put on a little show every day to some extent. And that little show is, I'm just like the people John Locke imagined. I'm totally individual. I don't have any obligations aside from being here to do my job. I don't have any kids sick at home. I don't have any elderly parents. I don't have anything going on except to be here and do my job. And in a certain way, we don't like people to come to work and just complain about their home life all the time, right? You come to do your job, right? But the ideal worker, that's what one sociologist calls it, the ideal worker acts out this fiction of non-relatedness. Like, I'm going to go up the ladder to the extent that I can play this role better than you. And so if you have kids at home and I don't, I can play the role more easily because I'm not going to get any calls. And so success, economic success in the waged economy has hinged on, can you play this role of the ideal worker? Who's been more able to play it? By and large, not everybody. It's been men. Why? Because of the setup that said somebody can be home holding down the fort or making the dentist appointments or taking the kid to the doctor, so that the men, and I'm not saying that as a way of putting down men, I'm just saying this is the way it's been set up. Okay? Now women say, okay, I want someday, I want to go out there too and have a nice, interesting job and so forth and so on. But when they leave, what happens? It's not like the men then say, oh, okay, I'll come back here and work in the care economy. And so we have the life we're living today, right? We're all out working, we're at school and so forth, and it's really hard to figure out how to take care of the care economy. So this idea that it's hard for women because they tend to be the caregivers, I want to just give you two examples of this. Currently, and this is a very recent statement by Joan Williams, who is a legal scholar. The penalty for working part-time in the U.S., 21% cut in hourly earnings, not because you're working part-time, but you just make less if you have less than full-time hours, is much higher in the United States than in other countries. Twice as high as in the UK, 7 times higher than in Sweden. So if I say, I think I'll work part-time so I can take care of the home economy, I'm going to take a 21% cut in the hourly pay I get, not just because it's less hours. Joan Williams says, women with children are especially disadvantaged. Having a child, quote, is the worst economic decision a woman can make, in part because workplace discrimination against mothers is the strongest and most open form of gender discrimination. When researchers, and this was very recently in the United States, gave subjects identical resumes with a 3-word difference, what do you think the difference was? Not quite, almost. One but not the other listed membership in the PTA. They saw dramatic results. The mothers, the ones who had that on their resume, were 79% less likely to be hired. And this was an experiment where they gave people, who work in the business world, and they were 100% less likely to be promoted. They were offered an average of $11,000 less than salary and held to higher performance and punctuality standards. A strong college education prepares graduates to engage society and economy as it's structured now. You are getting an education if you're in school, or you got one so that you can deal with the world as it is right now, right? But CNR's Catholic pro-woman mission also presses faculty and it's radical. It's radical, it's not how the world works, but it's right, I think. As John Williams says, quote, "The present way we structure work with an ideal worker defined as someone who takes no time off for caregiving," and that's what it means to be ideal, "discriminates against women and creates a system that hurts men and children as well." It's not just women who suffer, follow the women. Look what's going on with the women, it's going to be for everyone else too. If the next generation of mothers is to be able to have rewarding work and a rewarding family life, we must expand, this is Williams, we must expand women's choices, and to do this we must change the definition of the ideal worker. The ideal worker, she concludes, this definition shouldn't exclude women because they have children and provide care for their children. And I would say it shouldn't exclude anybody who's a caregiver, because there are men taking care of their parents. There are, men who are single fathers. Anyone who's a caregiver should not be penalized and say, well, you're not really the best worker. I'd much rather have you because you have no attachments. To define the ideal worker, says this legal scholar, in this way, discriminates against all women and all caregivers. And in fact, she's got a legal project working now to say, isn't it discriminatory if we don't give people their due for caregiving? Isn't that actually a legal thing? And that's how, in America, that's how we sometimes get things done, through looking at it legally. To summarize, modern Catholic economic thought holds that market economy should serve the livelihood of everybody in it. It upholds the significance of the care economy, in other words, what you do at home and work at home, and women's contributions to it. It advocates for living wages and dignified work conditions for men and women alike. Both in the UN and in the Catholic corners, you hear suspicion and worry right now regarding the growing disparities of wealth. It's getting more unequal in our country and in our world. Fewer people have a whole bunch and more people have less. And this is not a good thing. For 100 years, Catholic teaching has been saying that, at least. Especially when some people don't have enough. It's okay to have more. In fact, Obama said something like that today about the financial, execs. It's okay to have more. It's okay to do well, but not when everybody else isn't, and when you're taking advantage of them to some extent to keep yourself okay. All of this disproportionately affects women, especially in developing countries. That when you have these problems, there are flaws in the economy. The economy isn't working well if these things aren't being attended to, which is even if we're making a lot of money. So it's a different way of looking at economy. There's also these tensions I mentioned earlier about the meanings and implications of gender equality and livelihood in 21st century, here at home, but also all around the world. First of all, there's a tension between, and this is, it's a little structural, but I think hopefully you see how it fits. There's a tension between the actual interdependence of the care and wage economies. In other words, care economy is the home, what goes on in the home. And the wage economy over here is what goes on. The wage economy wouldn't work if the care economy over here wasn't working. Does that make sense? It wouldn't work. All the stuff that gets done at home that doesn't get paid for and so forth, if that isn't working, then the wage economy doesn't work. Because you need those people to be able to leave and pretend like they're not related all day to anybody else who's going to work, right? Then they go home and they get kicked and they don't have to pretend anymore. And so, in fact, a wage economy is always depending on the unpaid care economy. Always, okay? So there's actual interdependence there. And you also need someone to bring money home to your house, so it works both ways, right? And the system that actually gives value and power mainly to the money economy. So the value and the power goes to the wage money economy, not to the home economy. So you need each other, but we're the ones who get the power and the money over here, not so much over here. That's a tension, is my point. So, and meanwhile, this economy is the prime thing, the wage economy, and in fact, while relying on the home economy, it undervalues and disregards those contributions. Secondly, there's a tension between the push toward equal opportunity for women and men in the paid workforce, which we've seen over the years, and in most cultures, women's typically heavier responsibilities in the unpaid household workforce. They typically, all the studies show, I don't care if we're in the 21st century, women do more at home than men, no offense to the men here. But it's just the way the numbers, it may not be true for you, right? Numbers don't tell you anything about actual people you're talking to, But statistically, it's still She says, it is not acceptable for women to constitute 70% of the world's 1.3 billion absolute poor, the people who live on less than $1 a day. It is not acceptable for women to work 2/3 of the world's working hours but earn only 1/10 of the world's income and own less than 1/10 of the world's property. Many fundamental changes must be made. That's the understatement of the year. In a UN version of the Follow the Women principle, and also a version of the Catholic commitment for the most vulnerable, that's a big principle in modern Catholic teaching. Want to know what to do? Look at who's most vulnerable. That's called the option for the poor and vulnerable. Want to know where to go next? Think about how it's going to affect the most vulnerable. Okay? Hinze further says, economic development, she's talking to the UN now, must be considered as it is seen, quote, through the eyes of the world's poorest women. Then you'll get your glasses on straight as to what to do next. Isn't that interesting that she says that? Because that's not a religious view at all. It's the UN. There's one more tension that exists between justice advocates who want, and this is the tension. Some people think economic justice for women and all sorts of other justice for women means equal responsibilities in the care and money economy for everybody. Men should be in here half the time, and women should be in here half the time. You know, men should change the diaper, women should change the diaper. Women should be the CEO, men should be the CEO. It should be like a completely shared and completely the same for men and women. That's one way of thinking about economic justice for women. On the other hand, there are those who want justice for women who see women as differently and properly more heavily involved than men in the work of the care economy, especially with children. It's kind of that question of, are women different? Do they have different gifts? And if so, are they better with children? You've all had these conversations. This tension, you can see this tension right in Catholic social teaching because it has a mixture of equal rights and participation talk, everybody should be the same, and gender complementarity talks. Everybody's different and they have their different gifts. When it gets into the actual structure of the church, you know how that works itself out. Everybody's equal and the same, everybody's a child of God, but there are certain gifts that make some people fit, and so forth. Okay. It's an ongoing, messy tradition that we're part of here. Now, in the past, interestingly enough, that homemaker, breadwinner, that was a way of taking this big mess and making it work, kind of streamlining it, saying, okay, here's one way to make it work. If you have a homemaker and a breadwinner, then somebody's getting the money and somebody's taking care of the home. Lots of times women who are feminists today would say, oh, yeah, that's so out of date. But it serves a purpose. And I see my students, and maybe some of you feel this way too, saying, you know what, you may laugh, you older women, but I want to stay home because given the structures right now, my family isn't going to be taken care of if I can't stay home. Now, what does that assume? She's got to have somebody who's going to have money to let her stay home, right? And that is quite an assumption in this day and age. That's quite an assumption, isn't it? 20-year-olds are, somebody who are 20 here, so I don't want to. It's I don't know what's going to happen. No, I don't know. You don't know what's going to happen, and it may work out. But it's also not irrational for those women to say that because they're looking around at the situation and saying, the best deal would be if I could stay home. I don't see my husband staying home. So my point is that model serves a purpose. The question is, how do we serve that purpose given the realities of today that are not, both because women and men don't necessarily want to conform to those things or can't, single-parent families and so forth, and because the world is not moving in that direction where people are going to stay home and other people are going to go out. So there's a tension there. Given this, we need really good, lively dialogue between Catholic economic teaching, social movements for the empowerment of women and men and workers, and the concrete experience and wisdom of women and men who work. And that's where I put, like, who would that exclude, the women who work, but especially women who are juggling the workplace as well as the home. In this period of economic stress, they call it now the Great Recession. Did you know that? Now they've named this period of time the Great Recession, capitalized. When familiar structures, familiar ways of doing things may need to be refounded, places like CNR can be seedbeds for imagining, strategizing, and initiating fresh paths, along with others, toward a more dignified economic livelihood livelihood for women and those with and for whom they care. I want to make one further connection between the story of the College of New Rochelle and the larger story of the struggle for economic justice for all women, men, and children. I believe CNR's story actually reflects the best aspirations and meanings of feminism in our day. It's not a word my students like to use very much. I don't know if you talk about it around here at all anymore. Why do you think people don't like that word? Feminism. Huh? Why? Somewhat demeaning?
Makes you feel inferior.
Makes you feel inferior if you don't happen to be a woman, for example, a man, for example. No, that's true. I think that's right. I think the divisiveness, people don't want to be divisive. That's one reason, yes.
It's like you're comparing yourself to men, to women, to men. Like, why there needs to be a comparison? Why do we have to compare? We put our standards and the man level, and why do we have to do that? So.
Okay, right. Many times feminism, I hear what I think you're saying is that feminism has stood for women getting to do and being like everything men have gotten to do and been like, and is that really the best path? Those are probably the two biggest problems with the term. And so it's not a word that's popular. So bear with me, because I'm not using it in necessarily that sense. What I mean is, who is a feminist, okay, in the way I'm talking about it here? Anybody, man or woman, who really grasps and acts on the fact that we've been talking about so far, that as the well-being of women goes, so goes the well-being of children, men, families, and society. Another way to put this is, anyone who says the well-being of women always needs to be paid attention to and given equal attention in any situation. Though this connection, in other words, to find justice, follow the women. Though this connection is often missed or misunderstood, a feminist focus in this sense, I think, that women are human beings too. Okay, that almost seems obvious. Okay, so what? But that's what feminism really means. Women are human beings too, and they need to be considered equally with any situation. Is a necessary part of a Catholic vision that wants to welcome everybody to the feast of life. Likewise, feminism in this sense is a crucial dimension of every small and big effort to combat economic justice and to provide for the betterment of our children. Because society as a whole doesn't do well if women as a whole are doing well. So it's in everybody's interest to help women do well. Okay? That's not leaving out men. And feminism in this sense, I think, is the perfect way to describe the founders, the mission of the Ursuline community of New Rochelle, and New Rochelle past and present. In fact, and I'll skip over because I know I'm going long here. In fact, what I think is, I think you can see in this tradition something that Sharon Welch has called the practice of an ethics of risk, a feminist ethics of risk. This is the idea that people in the past and the present who haven't had much power, who've had a lot of tough things in their lives, who've gotten together in what Welch calls beloved communities and said, okay, we can't change the whole world, what can we do? How do we connect with one another and hold one another so that we can stick our necks out and try something new, even though it might fail, and then we come back and regroup and try again? That's the ethics of risk. It's the opposite of our dominant way of looking at the world that says, I need to be in control. I need to act like it, pretend like I'm in control. I've got it all under control. That's how we're supposed to act. That's, again, that little act you're supposed to put on in work, right, every day. I've got it under control. I know what's going to happen. I got everything covered, and it's going to be fine. And when I can act that way and make it happen, then I'm successful. Right? That's kind of what our ideal is in terms of how to work in the world. And Welch and others say, you know, when you act that way and you run into disappointment, those are the people who often give up. Because she worked with people in the anti-nuclear war movement, and she says, you know, all my friends gave up and just went out to the suburbs. Why? Because they didn't succeed completely, or people who worked in civil rights. They didn't succeed completely, and so they gave up. Because they wanted it to be completely controlled. Ethic of risk says you're never going to control it all. It's never going to be, the kingdom of God will not be on earth completely. Let's take a step forward. And when you get knocked down, come home to our community. We'll hold you. Let's start again. And that's the ethic of risk. And I think you can see that in the Ursuline tradition. You know, what must have been like for 12 women in 1720 to get on a boat in France and stay on the boat for 5 months? Can you imagine grandmother used to say, God can make a straight lick with a crooked stick. They talk about God being an on-time God, you know. It might not come when you want. He's there on time.
Right.
Things like that, okay? That's the power and wisdom of a beloved community that keeps people risking and trying, even though so many generations died before they saw their children really do better. That's the kind of hope and vision plus hard-headedness plus realism that you can see in this Ursuline tradition, I think, that we're celebrating today. And so to some extent or another, I'm saying we're all invited to be part of that, and maybe we already are part of that. Just to go back to the women for a few minutes toward the end here, think of Sister Angela, who advised her sisters to always be open to the unexpected way God might be working in the world. If things change and it becomes necessary to do something differently, do it. Be wise about it, but do it, she said. And she also said, move forward confidently in faith. This is the one who died 5 years after she finally got her order. And you look at her life on one level and say, well, she didn't have a very successful life. Lost everybody she loved, took her years to get what she wanted done, and then she died. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be, I don't want to disrespect the founder, but I'm saying if you look at it from the eyes of the powerful people in the world, it's not very impressive. But I'm talking about this is what real power in the world is about. That's what this school and this tradition is about. Think about Irene Gill. She comes from Ireland at 12 years old. She throws all her skills into this idea that we have to figure out new ways of educating people to deal with all the changing things in America in 1900. And people did think she was kind of nuts, you know, Irene's folly. But she was working with a man's world. And when I say a man's world, I don't mean every man. You know, when you say a man's world, there are some men that have had power. Not every man. We always have to remember that. But women were not considered to be the center here. And go up to about the 60s and 70s, Sister Dorothy Ann. She continues this tradition and transformation thing. She moves CNR to the forefront in the struggle to change or make up for the violent and complicated effects of structural sin, the sins of racism, classism, and violence, locally and internationally. Other schools were so far behind this school. Sister Dorothy Ann was a leader dealing with these things. One thing that really, really struck me was a story about how after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, that spring, Sister Dorothy Ann was dean, and some of you know this because you were here. She looked around and said, you know, here we are sitting here in New Rochelle, and we don't have any African-American students, 1968. If I sit around and wait for things to kind of happen, it's never going to happen. And so she went into the high schools in New Rochelle and said, I need to directly invite some African-American women to come to College of New Rochelle. And I'd love to know, I'm sure there's some around with these women that were initially involved in the first years, you know, the stories they may have to tell. And I'm sure it wasn't easy, and I'm sure there were lots of hurt feelings and difficulties and problems and misunderstandings along the way. Because when an Irish white woman tries to do something good about racism, they're going to make a lot of mistakes. I can speak because I am an Irish white woman. And so there's this need for dialogue. And it sounds to me like Sister Dorothy was good at dialogue. She set up lots of dialogue, Jewish-Christian dialogue, Northern Ireland dialogue, you know, race justice dialogue. So here she is continuing to do this. Now these women in their company, I think you can call them holy riskers for the kingdom. Holy riskers. They were out there risking. And I'm not so sure that isn't so different from what each of us is called to be, a holy risker. Someone who risks, yes, for my well-being, but also for the larger community. And that's what it means to go to school when it's not easy to go to school, or to stick your neck out when it's not easy, and so forth. They kept their eyes, they had a lot of setbacks, they had a lot of reversals, they had a lot of unpredictable circumstances, but they kept their eyes on the star, which was their mission, might say that this tradition is powered by not dream love, but reality love. Hard-headed, but also trying to change things for the better. Now, the mission for justice today of your school keeps changing. It's still, it's moving into think globally and act locally, and that's what it seems like you're all doing with the different campuses. There's real local energy in this school about how it is that we bring education out into the city of New York, but also thinking about the larger situation of the world that we want to serve. I have some things, but I'm going to stop here, about how there are, right now in this great recession, the need to fight for things like living wages for families in New York and around the world. That's something I'm sure many of you are involved in. The need to talk about providing family-paid sick leave days to working caregivers, particularly people who aren't on the top of the pay scale. The need to talk about the gender disparity in wages still. Women are supporting more families, but they still make that 22 cents less on the dollar. These are all parts of the job today for economic justice for women and men and families. In conclusion, we always give it something since that. Let's conclude by following, just for one more minute, one particular woman, Sister Dorothy Ann Kelly. On the morning she died, you may have read this or knew this. This last March, Sister Dorothy Ann prayed a prayer that she didn't then copy down in her address book because it must have struck her as being important. Here's the prayer. Gracious God, help us to work with you to make this world alive with your spirit and to build on earth a city of justice, love, and peace. Sister Dorothy Ann's simple but powerful prayer reminds us that there's enormous work to be done in our suffering world, but also reminds us that we undertake our work under divine care and amidst a beloved community where we, with our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, our friends, our brothers, follow the women who've gone before us, and also as our four mothers and four sisters, Ursula, Angela, Irene, Dorothy, Anne, and all the others. You have yours, I have mine. Pray for us, encourage us, and cheer us on. Happy Founders Day. Thank you. So I've been told that if you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, additions. I talked you into silence.
I'll ask something. This may be putting you on the spot. Can you say something about, on the one hand, this tradition that insists on the full dignity of all humans, that has spawned religious orders of women and men, but of women, who have made a great difference and who work and are committed to doing justice and bringing about this vision of justice in a church that is so suspicious of that they're now investigating those groups.
So I'm not sure everybody knows about this, but there's a big investigation. They're calling, well, it depends on what you call it. They call it a visitation. So like the big honchos in Rome are coming over to meet with all the women's religious communities like the Ursulines and the Sacred Hearts and sort of check on how they're doing their mission. And it's only in the United States that this is going on. And so it's caused a lot of upset among religious women in this country as we've given our lives and worked our hearts out, for the kingdom, for the church, and you're treating us like you don't really quite trust what we're doing. We got to check up on you, and that's really is that kind of institution that's worked with with a limited view because of it's been limited to men. You know, in terms of the power people, not all men have been powerful in the Catholic Church, just some men. And so we're in a world today where two things are crossing, right? This really old institution that has done this, and all this new stuff that I was referring to, all these changes, and it's just the same as what goes on, I think, in our own homes with the relationships between men and women, because we were all brought up with certain ways of looking at this stuff, but things have changed, and things are changing. And so, you know, you might find it right in your personal relationships, but it also happens in a big institution like the church. The other thing is, I don't think the Roman Curia, the people who are in charge of Rome, understand American culture very well. And so, in fact, I have a friend who just went over, this isn't about the Roman Curia, but I have a friend who went over and spoke at a big Orthodox gathering in Romania about women in the church. And this person is a religious sister, and she wears regular clothes like this, and she goes to this place in where is it, Romania, and it's the Orthodox. I don't know, in Orthodox, the priests wear the long garments, and they often have a long beard. They're very traditional, is my point. And so she gets to the place, and she's the only woman. There's all these priests, you know, and so forth, and men. She's the only woman, and she gets up and talks about women in the future church, and people walked out on her. Not everybody, but a lot of people did. They didn't clap. And I think from the moment they looked at her, they thought, we don't understand you. You're supposed to be a sister, and you're wearing regular clothes, and you're talking about... They thought that she was going to talk about the church as the bride of Christ. Seriously, they thought that. And there are people... And she said, you know, why did you invite me? You know what my views are, and so forth. But the point I'm making is, that to me is a great image of a church that's been around for a really long time, and where this idea of women being equal is like a very new idea. Very new idea. 50 years ago, I wouldn't have been standing up here probably. You wouldn't have been in a school like this. Although CCNR was ahead of its time because it was educated women before. But certainly, theologians were all priests, sometimes known this way. So I'm just saying, I think we're caught in a vortex here to a certain extent of history. You know, and that's where I so admire religious communities. I don't know your community, but religious communities who are American communities, many of whom are getting older, who are saying, we're seeding for the future. We're seeding. We don't even know what God wants and what God needs. So 150 years ago, God needed nuns and habits to teach little kids in a school. In the next 100 years, God might need something completely different. Lay people, you know, not in habits to it. And I hear this from older sisters I know, and I so admire that. Like, well, we came about to help the kingdom. God's got something new in God's mind, perhaps, and we'll just see what happens. And what can we do to seed the future? I love that. You know? That's a really, talk about ethics and risk. You know, we'll dedicate ourselves to our lives to this, but we don't know if anything will come of it in the future. You know? So I know that's about the best I can do with that. It's tough though. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. That's what I hear from a lot of religious women. Yes.
Christine, just to expand a little bit on Elizabeth's point, and I think you expressed it very well, I think the problem is that the Catholic faithful or the non-Catholic community, they look at issues that Elizabeth has articulated, and they look at clearly a second-class relationship of women to their church. For many, we could spend a long time talking about that, but I think it's pretty obvious. So the question then becomes my wife always says that the pedophilia crisis that has really created all sorts of havoc, not only with the victims, the children, but also with the larger community, that would not have happened if women had more of an active role in the church in different ways. This was essentially created by men.
You know,
So one last question. The question is, what I'm concerned about is the great social teaching of the church, but it creates almost a scandal among the Catholic community when you have these incredible dichotomies that you described between the institutional church and then the real life that we all have to live as Catholics
right.
or as non-Catholics.
Right. Lost my first thought. Let's work with my second thought. You said the incredible dichotomy between just grace teachings in the institutional church, and I thought of the ads right now say, I'm a PC, I'm a PC, I'm a PC. Who's the institutional church? I often make that dichotomy too. There's us, then there's the institution. But you know what? You're the institutional church. I'm the institutional church. I may not have all the power in the institutional church, but I have some power. Even the setup of the rules of the institutional church give me several things. One, I must follow my conscience. Even if the Pope tells me X, if I really believe Y is true, I have to follow my conscience. That's the freedom I have. My baptism makes me a priest, prophet, and king. So I have all the same gifts as the Pope does, or whomever you want to talk about as far as an institutional leader, or the curate does. Number three, you have to think of the institution, again, as I think of Catholic relief services going all around the world and keeping people from starving, and sisters who are working in the worst parts of the AIDS crisis in Africa who are helping people. That's all the institutional. So I like to keep my eye on the bigger picture of the institutional church, because it is false to say the church is the hierarchy in Rome. It just, but we have to kind of think that, Catholics often think that way. But it's really false. And I think that's really important.
Plus, there's a great need to, as you point out, the role of informed conscience. We had a theologian come here before, a couple of months ago, and I just think the general Catholic laity is not really educated relative to the primacy of the informed conscience as it relates to some of these big issues that you just described. I think that creates a lot of problems.
Let me just tell you, this seems unrelated, but let me see if you think it's related. Next Wednesday at 4, there's an author coming who's written a book. Her name is Donna Fridas. It's called Sex and the Soul. Some of you have heard of it. She went to a bunch of Catholic, but not Catholic, college campuses and talked to students about their faith and about their sex lives. And she's like 30 years old, and she actually got kids to open up, and she has all these interviews, and she has all this data. And she went to 2 evangelical schools that were very strictly Christian, and everybody took purity pledges and stuff like that. And 2 Catholic schools and several just regular non-anything schools. And she found, of all those schools, she found a lot of things, but to your point, one of the things she found was the Catholic schools and the Catholic students were so disempowered and unable to talk about their faith in relationship to anything important compared to the evangelical students who were talking with their peers about what Jesus wanted from them in their lives, who were reading their Bibles together. And she says, I'm not sure we would all want the rules that these campuses followed, but these were young people who could speak with power about their faith. That something about many of the Protestant traditions empower people to speak about their faith in a way that Catholics often aren't taught. I don't know if that rings true to you at all. And some of you, I know you're from different faith traditions here around the room. And she said the disempowerment of young Catholic people to say, hey, I have a voice, because some of these young evangelicals are writing books about dating and sex and love and what God wants from you. And she says, when I say to young Catholics, why don't you write some things about faith and dating or faith and love? And they say, we can't, there's all these rules. So when you have too much hierarchy, then people people feel disempowered. People feel like they don't have a voice. So part of, I think, our job is to figure out how our campuses, as well as everything else we're doing, can bring out the voice. But in parishes, you say, let's have a parish council, and lots of people, nobody signs up. Because we're so used to being hierarchical. We're so used to being we Catholics have got to, get it going from the grassroots. And I think we learn an awful lot. That's her point. She goes, many people will often turn their nose up at evangelical Christianity and say, oh, they're not as, sophisticated and so forth. Hey, but they've got power. They've got an empowerment that Catholics often lack. So, just a thought.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I find those findings surprise me, because I learned, as well as the other people we found that. I mean,
You're comparing it to
reacting
your
what she's
experience.
finding.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I think, as far as killing Vatican II goes, any historian will tell you it takes 100 years for a council to sort of settle in. Vatican II happened in 1963, 65. So we have to look back, down from, hopefully down, we'll be looking down. 65 years from now. That's right. Who knows? Maybe it's a big spiral. And say, in other words, Vatican II is still being born. That's how I put it. Okay. And that's the long view you get from looking at the history of something like the Renaissance too. To say there's a long haul here that goes beyond our lifetimes. And I don't want to disagree.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with what you're saying. But I do think, Freitas, and your point is raising serious questions about how do we empower our daughters, sisters, the people of the future, men and women of the future, to go forward with a strong voice. And she believes it has to do with as much as about campus culture, and I have a feeling around here this happens, where women and men are empowered in local ways to talk about what matters to them and to be seen as powerful voices about what matters to them. Not teachers just saying, here's what matters, but saying, no, you know what matters. Let's talk together. Because if you're 25 years old and I'm 50 years old, you have something to teach me too. If you're Hindu and I'm Jewish, you have something to teach me too. And so at a place like CNR, you've got an opportunity to empower voices, religiously as well as. The way we got it was through taking a whole bunch of classes. But if we're not going to do it that way, how are we going to do it?
But at Fordham, do you find
A lack of knowledge about the tradition? Yes.
or a voice?
Yep.
You do.
There's always exceptions to the rule.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want to?
I just wanted to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience.
Okay.